In the recent years, there's many Americans moving abroad, and with that, there may be some blind spots about whether or not they're still required to file their tax returns, even though they're no longer U.S. residents, but still maintain their U.S. citizenship. And so we'll discuss their tax requirements in a brief overview in this video. But here's a disclaimer. This information is nuanced. Everyone's tax obligations and requirements are very different and nuanced. So it would be prudent of you to meet with a tax advisor, a CPA, a tax expert that is familiar with non-US residents who are US citizens and what their tax requirements are. This information is for entertainment purposes and to provide guidelines for you to think about if you're living abroad. But hopefully, it can give you enough information for you to meet with the tax experts so you can take the next steps to make sure you're compliant regarding the tax laws of the U.S. Also, the U.S. has a very unique tax burden, where it taxes U.S. citizens regardless of their residency. So that means regardless of where a U.S. citizen is living in the world, the U.S. still requires that individual to perhaps pay taxes or at least file their tax returns as part of their status as a U.S. citizen, regardless of their residency. So even though a person is not benefiting from living in the U.S., is not benefiting from social services, from the hospitals, from the roads, from the fire departments, from the police departments, from the airports, the U.S. still requires you to pay taxes regardless of that. The US and Eritrea are the only two countries in the world that have this unique tax burden, even though other countries are flirting with the idea of imposing tax obligations of non-residents based on their citizenship. US green card holders are also subject to this rule. So if we have an individual that lived and worked in the US for say 50 years under a green card but never became a US citizen and decides he or she wants to retire and return to their home country, they too are still obligated to the tax structure of the US. US is indifferent that they're no longer residents. Because they're US green card holders, they still must meet the tax obligations imposed by the US. So up and until that individual decides to formally hand in his or her green card to the appropriate immigration department, they're still subject to the tax requirements of the US. Yes, it follows you regardless of where you are. If you're a US green card holder or a US citizen, this is something for you to know. This is up and until you renounce your U.S. citizenship, which I discussed in a previous video. So what are the tax filing requirements of an individual living abroad? So there may be two that apply to you, but again, this is nuance. So the first one to think about is the Foreign Bank Account Report, FBAR, and the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA. FATCA was passed in 2010 under the Obama administration, which required non-US banking institutions to report on any individuals that may have a connection with the US. So how do they determine connection? They look at the person's residency, previous residency, their citizenship. And so if they determine that this individual is a US citizen, owning interest in a bank account in a foreign territory, then they must report this to the Department of Treasury, the U.S. Department of Treasury. Another component of FATCA also requires the individual to report on this foreign asset. So this law is twofold. So it requires the foreign institution to report on individuals that may hold assets in their bank, their identities, and the amount of the asset, and it also requires the individual to report on their assets in such foreign institution. How does this person report on their foreign assets? Through the form 8938 with the IRS. It's an IRS form that they report on their assets. So why was this law passed? Essentially, the U.S. government realized they were missing out on billions, if not trillions of dollars on tax revenue of expats living abroad, and they wanted a piece of the pie. They passed a law to impose banking institutions to report on these assets to make sure and to police these banking institutions to make sure the U.S. government had an idea of how much money U.S. citizens living in foreign countries were making and to report on this amount. And so it also required the individuals to report on this amount, untaxed revenue out there in the world, and they wanted a piece of the pie. So again, this tax law applies to U.S. citizens and green card holders who have foreign assets. So in essence, it's a snitching program that was introduced requiring banks in these foreign institutions to report on bank balances of those with connections to the U.S. Failure to report will result in really draconian laws being passed on these banking institutions, and they will be iced out of being able to participate in the U.S. banking system. And as we know, the U.S. banking system is one of the largest and secure. So it would be prudent for them to be compliant so as to not lose out on being able to participate in the U.S. banking system. The next form where a person may be required to report is the FinCEN Form under FBAR, as I mentioned. So the FinCEN Form has a lower threshold than the FATCA form. And the person who has to report on to FinCEN is if you are a U.S. citizen, resident taxpayer, or domestic business entity, you own, control, or have a signature authority over foreign banks with a combined value of $10,000. So this is the singular threshold amount that a person who has in a foreign bank account must report. The FBAR form is not part of a person's tax returns. They're sent to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. FATCA is reported on your tax returns in the Form 8938, and FinCEN is sent to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Again, not everyone has to file both of these forms. You have to meet with the tax advisor to see if you fall into the criteria requiring you to file one or both of these forms. FATCA, on the other hand, reporting requirements who hold accounts overseas, but it also deals with non-account assets such as business and trust ownership and certain contractual investments with foreign parties, and it's a higher threshold amount than FinCEN. So even though there might be overlapping information on both of these forms, they are filed separately. Again, FATCA is filed with your tax return, and FinCEN is sent to the Financial Crimes Network. So be sure to know about that and meet with the tax advisor. In terms of penalties can be enforced for failure to comply, but there's also amnesty programs where the government will measure willfulness if this person willfully neglected to file or if it was intentional, and that is how the government essentially, that's the framework if they impose the penalty. So again, this is a brief overview of tax requirements for those living abroad. Please meet with a tax expert to discuss further. Also, if you are considering the moving abroad journey and you do not know where to begin, I do have a move abroad coaching program where you can meet with me one-on-one to discuss the things that you need to be thinking about regarding moving abroad, taxes being one of them. It's often overlooked because people think, oh, I'm no longer living in the U.S., I'm not required to pay taxes. So we discuss that. We also look through the visa process as to which country you're applying to and if you can meet the minimum requirements. We talk about your assets in the U.S., what you should be doing with those to protect them and help them grow while you are abroad, or to conserve them so that they're protected in the event you plan on returning to the U.S. We also deal with healthcare, your healthcare in the U.S. if you are on any social service programs such as Medicare or Medicaid, how to handle that transition if you are no longer a resident. So it's a very dynamic course. As an attorney, I get to flesh through and iron out all the implications of you moving abroad, so you are aware of the impact of you moving abroad, and we turn over every stone so that you could be comfortable moving abroad. So if you would like to come into my coaching container, the link will be in the description box. Please let me know if you have any questions regarding this video, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.